Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today, I'm doing a video on a subject that really I should have done way back in the beginning of my YouTube channel. It's a subject that is a very important subject to discuss, a subject that has had a lasting impact uh, to this day on the United States, particularly on the indigenous peoples of the United States, the Native Americans. And it is a subject pertaining to one of the largest, not the only one, but one of the largest atrocities that the United States has ever committed against the Native American peoples and nations of North America, uh, pretty much in general. And that is the Native American boarding schools and the cultural genocide of Native Americans using these boarding schools. Now, the most famous of these boarding schools, right off the bat, uh, is a place known as Carlisle Industrial School, which you can see here. And this is going to be something that we'll talk about later on in the video, but I just wanted to point out when we are talking about Native American boarding schools, we are talking about institutions like Carlisle Industrial School. All right, now, real quick, we need to define some terms. First, starting with genocide. So, genocide, according to the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies and the definition of genocide and related crimes from the United Nations' own website, is defined as, and I quote, the intentional and systematic destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, whole or in part. This destruction can be achieved through various means, including killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, and imposing conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. The key element is the intent to destroy the group as a group. And then the second term I want to define is the term cultural genocide, which is not actually a form of genocide defined by the United Nations uh, or in the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies, but it is a form of genocide defined by other experts in the act of genocide. So, cultural genocide is defined as the deliberate destruction of a culture, often by a dominant group, with the aim of eliminating a distinct people's identity and values. It involves actions that undermine a culture's integrity, dispossesses people of their lands and resources, and imposes assimilation or integration. This can include forced cultural assimilation, suppression of language and traditions, and the destruction of cultural heritage. And it is important to note that cultural genocide and genocide as we know it from, say, for example, the Holocaust, um, uh, go hand in hand. They are not mutually exclusive in any way. So before we get into the rest of the video, I think it is important to bring forward a trigger warning. This video will cover heavily disturbing subject matter such as sexual assault, abuse, and genocide. So just be forewarned. I will not be able to stop every time uh, the disturbing subject matter that is in this video comes up because it's just the nature of the subject I'm talking about. All of these things are deeply entwined uh, with Native American boarding schools. So, again, trigger warning for this video covering disturbing subject matter such as sexual assault, abuse, and genocide. All right. So before we get into uh, the Native American boarding schools within the United States, such as Carlisle Industrial School, first we need to go back further in time to look at the sort of groundwork, the building blocks of what eventually would become these Native American boarding schools. And that is early attempts by Europeans and the United States to culturally assimilate Native Americans. So, some of the earliest examples of these attempts to convert and culturally assimilate Native American peoples came when French Jesuit missionaries built missions in New France, what is now Canada and much of the United States, to convert the Native American peoples of the region. However, much of the Christian spiritual practices were incompatible with traditional Native American religious practices, which would lead several Native American nations, such as the Huron, to execute Jesuit missionaries as they viewed Christianity as a threat to their way of life. This would make the Jesuit attempts at conversion a mixed success at best. And this would happen between 1609 and the 1690 CE. Then, in the English colonies, the Puritan General Court of Massachusetts would pass and quote act for the propagation of the gospel amongst the Indians on 1646 CE. And then shortly after that, Puritan Reverend John Eliot and other missionaries would begin preaching Christianity to the Native American nations of New England, and Eliot would translate the Bible into the Massachusetts language and publish it uh, as the Eliot Indian Bible, with this all happening between 1646 and 1663 CE. And then by 1675 CE, 20% of New England's Native Americans were living in praying towns, or towns of Christian Native Americans who had converted to Christianity. Meanwhile, in Spanish colonies such as Florida and California and New Mexico, Franciscan friars would establish missions in Spanish colonies to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And this would all happen in the 1670s CE. And when they did this, indigenous religious practices, religious figures, and ceremonial sites would then be outlawed in said Spanish colonies. And actually, I want to go back to the slide here real quick. Uh, while the Spanish Empire outlawed these indigenous religious practices, figures, and religious figures and ceremonial sites, for anyone who has watched my video on the Pueblo Revolt, uh, you know that this did not necessarily end well for the Spanish Empire. And I will include a link to my video on the Pueblo Revolt in the iCard. Okay, so with that in mind, starting in the early 1700s CE, Christian missionaries such as the Quakers and the Moravians would begin to migrate to Native American nations in the Northeast, hoping to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Then, in the 1790s CE, George Washington would formulate a policy to encourage Native American nations to, quote, civilize, with Washington's policy including a 6-point plan for civilization, which included impartial justice towards Native Americans, regulated buying of Native American lands, promotion of commerce, promotion of experiments to civilize or improve Native American society, whatever that really means. And then presidential authority to give presents and punishing those who violated Native American rights. And here's the sources that I got this from. The source that I got this from. As a result of the United States civilizing plan, many Native American nations would adopt European practices while also maintaining most of their traditional cultural practices. And you can really see this in this picture here of a Choctaw individual on his way to a European style house, while he's still practicing to some degree the traditional Three Sisters method of Native American cultures, while also enslaving African Americans, um, which is, again, an American and European thing. And it's something that should not have happened, but it did. And in addition to all that, you can see the Choctaw individual and his wife wearing traditional Choctaw garb. So again, they adopted European practices while also maintaining their traditional cultural practices. And it should be noted that this is very much different from the forced cultural assimilation that we'll talk about later in the video in relation to Native American boarding schools, like Carlisle Industrial School. Uh, and actually, with that in mind, between 1801 and the 1830s CE, Christian missionaries did build mission schools in southern Native American nations in attempts to convert Native American children to Christianity. However, unlike again the Native American boarding schools like Carlisle that forcibly attempted to assimilate and forcibly assimilated Native American children, these missionary missions and missionaries were very different, as these missionaries were often invited by prominent Native American politicians and often worked with Native American communities to convert, and it was very much a choice for Native American children within the southern Native American nations like the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, the Choctaw Nation, etc., to convert to Christianity. Of course, that's not the case across the board. There are definite examples of forced conversion, but not nearly to the degree that you would see later with schools like Carlisle Industrial School. Which now brings us to our next section, the genocide of Native Americans at the hands of the United States. So, between the 1810s and 1840s CE, the United States would defeat Native American nations east of the Mississippi River and would massacre many of their citizens in multiple wars. With these wars including the First Creek War and the First Seminole War, which with the First Creek War happening between 1813 and 1814 CE, and the First Seminole War happening between 1817 and 1818 CE. And then another example is the Black Hawk War, which happened between August 6th and 27th, 1832 CE. And I've already done um, an entire series on the early United States imperial expansion with which these wars are a part of that I will include in the iCard, the entire series. There's actually, to be fair, one video left that I need to do in that series, but it will be coming out shortly. But either way, it's important for people to watching this video to go and watch those videos to get the bigger context on what occurred within these wars. And then between 1817 and the 1840s CE, the United States would forcibly remove Native American nations to west of the Mississippi River, which is known as the Indian Removal, which was caused by the Indian Removal Act and included a multitude of different events known as all known as the Trail of Tears, or in the case of the Potawatomi Trail of Death. And as you can see on this map, roughly 20 different Native American nations were forcibly removed uh, to from the east of the Mississippi in the United States to west of the Mississippi in Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas Indian Territory. And here's a more up close picture of this map. As a result of Indian removal, roughly 14,000 Native Americans would die as a result of starvation, exposure to harsh weather, and warfare. Then, between the 1830s and 1900 CE, the United States would begin to expand into the Great Plains, Pacific Northwest, and the west coast of North America, as well as the southwestern part of the United States. And you can sort of see that expansion here on this picture. During this expansion, the United States would commit multiple brutal massacres against Native American nations. Most often, these massacres are of villages whose inhabitants consist primarily of unarmed women, children, and elders, with these massacres happening between the 1840s and 1900 CE. One of the earliest massacres occurred when Major John C. Fremont entered California as the leader of a surveying expedition of 60 white American volunteers and Native American scouts. While in California, Fremont's forces would meet white Americans who claimed that an encampment of 1,000 Native Americans was preparing to attack white settlements. Fremont would then move his men up the Sacramento River in search of these Native Americans, with him beginning his search on March 30th, 1846 CE. Upon reaching Reading's Ranch, Fremont's force would find a large village of the Wintu Nation on April 5th, 1846 CE. Fremont would then order an advance on the Wintu village, advancing from three sides on the Wintu, who are unable to flee the camp as the majority of their ranks are women and children, and they are pinned against the river. The men of the Wintu camp would form a defensive line with the women and children behind them. Fremont would then order his force to give no quarter and would promptly slaughter an estimated 900 Wintu men, women, and children in an event that becomes known as the Sacramento River Massacre. Here are some excerpts of eyewitness accounts of the Sacramento River Massacre. The first excerpt comes from the memoirs. The first two excerpts come from the memoirs of Thomas E. Breckinridge, with excerpt one stating, and I quote, the settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and pappooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. And then excerpt two from the memoirs of Thomas C. Breckinridge reads, and I quote, I think that I hate an Indian as badly as anybody, and have as good reason to hate them. But I don't think that I could have assisted in that slaughter. It takes two to fight or quarrel, but in that case there was but one side fighting and the other side trying to escape. And then the third excerpt comes from the memoir of Kit Carson, a renowned frontiersman who participated in the battle. And the excerpt from his memoir reads, and I quote, during our stay at Lawson's, some Americans that were settled in the neighborhood came in stating there were about 1,000 Indians in the vicinity making preparations to attack the settlements. Requested assistance of Fremont to drive them back. He and a party of some few Americans that lived near started for the Indian encampment. Found them to be in great force, as was stated. They were attacked. The number killed I cannot say. It was a perfect butchery. Those not killed fled in all directions, and we returned to Lawson's. Had accomplished what we went for, and given the Indians such a chastisement that it would be long before they ever again would feel like attacking the settlements. And here are the sources that I got all this from. And then on November 29th, 1864 CE, United States Colonel John Shivington would order the 3rd Colorado Cavalry to attack a village of Cheyenne and Arapaho. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry would massacre roughly 600 of the village's inhabitants, most of whom were women and children. This event would become known as the Sand Creek Massacre. In fact, this massacre was so brutal that multiple United States soldiers were horrified at the actions of their fellow soldiers in the Sand Creek Massacre. And we can see this in multiple excerpts, specifically starting with an excerpt from Captain Silas Sewell, from a letter from Captain Silas Sewell to Major Edward Wynkoop regarding the Sand Creek Massacre that he sent on December 14th, 1864 CE, with the excerpt reading, and I quote, the massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours, and a good many Indians escaped. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. He cut one arm off and held the other with one hand and dashed the the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with her two children were on their knees begging for their lives of a dozen soldiers, within 10 feet of them, all firing. When one succeeded in hitting the squaw in the thigh, when she took a knife and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. One old squaw hung herself in the lodge. There was not enough room for her to hang. She held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. I saw two Indians hold one of another's hands, chased until they were exhausted. When they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck, both were shot together. They were all scalped, and as high as half a dozen taken from one head. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and a child taken out of her and scalped. White Antelope, War Bonnet, and a number of others had ears and privates cut off. Squaws' snatches were cut for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did here. But every word I have told you is the truth, which they do not deny. It was almost impossible to save any of them. Charlie Otterby saved John Smith and Windsor Squaw. I saved little Charlie Bent. George Bent was killed. Jack Smith was taken prisoner and murdered the next day in his tent by one of Dunn's company E. I understand the man received a horse for doing the job. They were going to murder Charlie Bent, but ran him into the fort. They were going to kill old Uncle John Smith, but Lieutenant Cannon and the boys of Fort Lyon interfered and saved him. They would have murdered old Bent's family if Colonel Tappan had not taken the matter in hand. And here is the source I got that from. And then we have an excerpt from a letter from Lieutenant Joseph A. Kramer, also to Major Edward Wynkoop, that he sent on December 19th, 1864 CE, that reads, and I quote, "We lost 40 men wounded and 10 killed, not over 250 Indians, mostly women and children. And I think not over 200 were killed and not over 75 bucks. With proper management, they could have all been killed and not lost over 10 men. After the fight, there was a sight I hope I may never see again. Bucks, women, and children were scalped. Fingers cut off to get the rings on them. And this is as much with officers as men, and one of those officers, a major and lieutenant colonel, cut off ears of all he came across. A squaw ripped open and a child taken from her. Little children shot while begging for their lives, and all the indignities shown their bodies that was ever heard of. Women shot while on their knees, with their arms around soldiers begging for their lives, things that Indians would be ashamed to do. To give you some little idea, squaws were known to kill their own children and then themselves rather than have them taken prisoner. Most of the Indians yielded 4 or 5 scalps. But enough. I know you are disgusted already." Then, on November 27th, 1868 CE, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, yes, that George Armstrong Custer of the Battle of Greasy Grass, also known as the Battle of Bighorn fame, uh, would lead the 7th United States Cavalry in an attack on the village of Cheyenne Leader Black Kettle, located on the Washita River. Custer and the 7th United States Cavalry would massacre roughly 150 Cheyenne, including roughly 75 women and children, and roughly 53 women and children were captured. This event would become known as the Washita Massacre. And here are some eyewitness accounts of the Washita Massacre, starting with an excerpt of a letter from J.S. Morrison, one of the Sheridan Scouts, written to sent to E.W. Wynkoop on December 14th, 1868 CE, that reads, and I quote, the excerpt reads, and I quote, "Dear Colonel, I arrived at this place yesterday all right. J.L. Bay accompanied me. He has recovered entirely from the slight indisposition he was laboring under when you left him in Topeka. He has obtained a situation under Major Inham, who has got in today from the south. John Smith, John Poisel, and John Fitzpatrick have gotten today. John S. was not in the fight, the Battle of Washita, but John P. and Jack were. They all agree in stating that the official reports of the fighting were very much exaggerated, that there was not over 20 bucks killed. The rest, about 40, were women and children. The prisoners have got in today. They consist of 53 women and children. One boy is an Arapaho. The rest are all Cheyennes. Miss Crocker is amongst them. She is badly wounded. She says that her child is killed. The woman says that Black Kettle is killed. And here's the source that I got that information on. And then we have an excerpt of a report sent by Custer himself to Lieutenant Colonel J. Schuler Crosby, with the report being sent on December 22nd, 1868 CE, with this excerpt reading, and I quote, the bodies of nearly all the warriors killed in the fight had been concealed or removed, while those of the squaws and the children who had been slain in the excitement and the confusion of the first charge, as well as in self-defense, were wrapped in blankets and bound with lariats, preparatory to removal and burial. Many of the Indian dogs were still found in the vicinity lately occupied by the lodges of their owners. They, probably subsisting on the bodies of the ponies that had been killed, and then covered several acres of ground nearby. As 10 days had elapsed since the battle, and scores of Indian bodies still remained unburied or unconcealed, some idea may be had of the uh, precipitate haste with which the Indians had abandoned that section of country. A thorough examination of the immediate battleground failed to discover anything uh, special report, worthy of special report, except that Indian bodies were found which had not been previously reported in my first dispatch, and which went to prove that we are all aware of now that the enemy's loss in killed warriors far exceeded the number 103 first reported by me. Again, here is the source that I got this from. And then we have this excerpt from an interview by the New York Sun of Benjamin H. Clark, chief of the scouts attached to the 7th Cavalry, with this interview happening on May 14th, 1899 CE. And it reads, and I quote, I got together about 60 women and children. The hunting and slaughter of fugitives continued during the great part of the morning. The Indians fought desperately, but were wholly at a disadvantage. I estimate the Cheyenne lost 75 warriors and fully as many women and children killed. The number of wounded was never known, but there are still Indians in western Oklahoma who bear scars received on that cold November day. The dusk of the morning gave cover for escape, or the bloodshed would have been greater. Custer, with whom I rode stirrup to stirrup, killed only one Indian, a warrior who was about to fire on him from only a few feet. Custer killed him with a pistol. After returning to the village with the women and children, I heard heavy firing down the river in the direction of Cook's sharpshooters. I rode rapidly in that direction and found a small party of warriors with their children at a bay under the embankment. During the freshet, a bank had been undermined, causing it to cave in. The mass of dirt made an excellent barricade, the Indians getting between it and the bank. They were protected from above by the overhanging turf, which had not been carried down by the dirt. The Indians were firing at the sharpshooters on the other side of the river. The latter was able to dislodge them. The shots of the Indians gradually grew fewer until they ceased altogether. The warriors were dead. It was then that I saw a terrible example of a Cheyenne mother's despair. A squaw arose from behind the barricade, holding a baby at arm's length. In her other hand was a long knife. The sharpshooters mistook the child for a white captive and yelled, "Kill the squaw! She's murdering a white child!" Before a gun could be fired, the mother, with one stroke of the knife, disemboweled the child and drove the knife to the hilt in her own breast and was dead. A trooper poked his carbine over the embankment and shot her through the head, but it was needless cruelty. And here's the source that I got that from. Then on April 30th, 1871 CE, 6 white Americans, 48 Mexican Americans, and 92 members of the Tohono O'odham nation would attack a group of Pinal and Aravipa Apache. I do apologize if I butchered that name to anyone who is a member of any of the Apache nations who is watching. Uh, with these Pinal and Ravipa Apache having surrendered to the United States Army at Camp Grant, Arizona. A total of 144 Arayavapas and Pinals would be killed and mutilated, nearly all of them scalped. 29 children would then be captured and sold in Mexico, where they were enslaved. This event would become known as the Camp Grant Massacre. And I do want to point out that yes, this was not actually a massacre that was uh, precipitated and initiated by the United States Army. However, it was initiated by United States citizens, white American citizens and Mexican American citizens. Uh, and then we have an excerpt of the testimony of Lieutenant Royal Whitman, uh, given in a trial on December 1871 CE, that I have brought forward because it shows that the instigators of the Camp Grant massacre were actually condemned by authorities. And in his excerpt, it reads, and I quote, I saw the dead bodies of several women that I recognized. Two were lying on their backs entirely naked and shot through the breast, apparently with pistol balls. I saw the dead bodies of children, perhaps six. They had died apparently by gunshot wounds. I recollect one child, perhaps 2 years of age, with the arm nearly cut off. Besides an old man, the only other dead body of a male was a boy, perhaps 16 years of age. And here's the source that I got that from. And then we have an excerpt of an oral tradition of the massacre given by an Apache elder known as Old Lon that was written down in 1948 CE. And it shows that Apache elders would lament and still lament the Camp Rat massacre. The excerpt reads, and I quote, creeping through the shadows toward this place were the Sai Kine, or the Sandhouse people, whom the Americans call the Papago or the Tohono O'odham. Silently, they crept up the bluff over the very trail we just climbed. Like jaguars, they crouched to spring. Then from those rims above flickered the signal. Moving swiftly through with their mesquite war clubs loosened, they surrounded the sleeping dancers, striking in every direction as they began to smash the skulls of the sleeping Arai. The screams of the dying ripped open the clear morning air. Roused from his sleep, Banjin ran from his wickiup toward the dance ground. As he yelled for his warriors to stand and fight, a Papago club crushed his head. Crumbling, he fell to the ground, amidst the slaughtered bodies of his people. After finishing those on the dance ground, the Papago began to hunt out those in the Kalas and the Wickiups. That's why I avoided those stone rings over there, for they are places of death. And from the rim above, Americans and Mexicans shot down those who tried to flee up canyon. Yes, there were Americans from Tucson there. We found out later that they were the ones who planned the whole thing. And when those human wolves with black and white skins got through their killing, they set fire to every known Kawa wickiup they could find before starting back toward Tucson. They circled Camp Grant so that the not on and his soldiers would not know that they had done what they had done. They carried into captivity 29 Aravipa children. The buzzards were beginning to circle when something stirred under a pile of dead. Pulling himself loose, Husky Bonjean tried to shake the dizziness from his bloody head as he staggered across the dance ground towards his kala, his wickiup, that stood under the cottonwoods, which we passed before starting to climb the bluff. His kawa, his wickiup, had not been burned, but before him on the ground lay the bodies of his young wives and their 5 children. Then from under a bundle of grass he heard the whimper of a baby. Bending over, he pulled back the grass and picked up his only living child, the tiny cheetah. With the baby in his arms, he avoided the dense ground and followed the rims until he reached that high point which noses so sharply down into the canyon. Turning back to look down on the scene of the massacre of the little running water, Banjin, the last of the Aravaipa chiefs, breathed a curse of vengeance against all white men. And here's that source that I got this from. Then, uh, well, for one thing, one thing that I need to point out, the importance of pointing out the Camp Garrett massacre is it highlights how, while yes, the United States Army was most certainly one of the biggest uh, tools by the United States of committing the genocide against the Native American nations of North America. The genocide of the Native American nations of North America was also precipitated and caused by everyday white American citizens. In fact, in many ways, white American citizens were just as destructive as the United States Army. Another good example of this is seen between the 1860s and 1870s CE, when railroad companies would pay large numbers of white American hunters to eliminate the American bison herds, both to obtain food for train laborers, uh, uh, sorry, to obtain food for train laborers, to prevent American bison herds from delaying trains, and to prevent the destruction of train tracks. This would lead many Native American communities on the Great Plains to starve due to the lack of food caused by these hunting activities. And this is actually talked about in the magazine Harper's Weekly, specifically in their December 14th, 1867 CE issue, where one they have a portrait, a picture showing the shooting of the American bison from trains on railroads, and they have a specific section of their newspaper dedicated to talking about buffalo hunting in reference to railroads and trains. Uh, on top of this, the United States government officials would order the United States Army to exterminate the American bison to force Native Americans to leave the Great Plains or starve to death. With these orders and the subsequent extermination of the American bison happening between 1869 and the 1890s CE. And we can see an example of these orders uh, in an excerpt from a letter sent from United States General William Tecumseh Sherman of the Atlanta Campaign in the Civil War fame to United States General Philip H. Sheridan, with the letter being sent on May 10th, 1868 CE, where Sherman states, and I quote, as long as buffalo are up on the Republican, the Indians will go there. I think it would be wise to invite all the sportsmen of England and America there this fall for a grand buffalo hunt and make one grand swoop of them all. Until the buffalo and consequently Indians are out from between the roads, we will have collisions and trouble. And here's the source I got that from. And then we can see another example in an excerpt from the memoir of United States Lieutenant General John M. Schofield, with his memoir being written in 1897 CE, that reads, and I quote, he never feels so happy as when he throws off a large part of his civilization and reverts to the life of a semi-savage. The only thing that saves him from total relapse is the fact that he takes with him those little comforts, both liquid and solid, which cannot be found in the woods. He thus keeps up the taste that finally draws him back to a civilized, or more accurately, semi-civilized life. If any sportsman knows of any reason that than that for not living like a savage when in his hunting camp, I would like him to give that reason to me. We returned to Fort Leavenworth in the spring and expected to make that our permanent home. Some necessary improvements had been made in the quarters during the winter, and no one could have desired a more comfortable residence, more congenial companionship, or more agreeable occupation than that of guarding and protecting the infant settlements of industrious but unarmed and confiding people rapidly spreading far out upon the plains. With my cavalry and carbine artillery encamped in front, I wanted no other occupation in life than to ward off the savage and kill off his food until there should no longer be an Indian frontier in our beautiful country. And here's the source that I got that from here. And then also, as uh, when Tecumseh Sherman alluded to, uh, white American hunters such as Buffalo Bill Cody would begin hunting the American bison in large numbers for their valuable fur. Some hunters even claim to have killed 10 to 20,000 bison for themselves, which would then cause more Native American communities to starve from lack of food due to the overhunting of the American bison, with all this happening between the 1870s and 1890s CE. In fact, due to the efforts of white American hunters and the United States Army, the American bison population was almost completely wiped out, which would have a devastating effects on the Native American nations of the Great Plains, with the American bison being nearly wiped out between officially nearly wiped out between the 1890s and 1900 CE. And I just want you all to take a minute to absorb the sheer number of bison skulls and bones within the scene and shown in these pictures, so you can truly sort of understand just how thorough and extensive the extermination of the American bison was. And here are some furs that also show this. So as you can see, even before the and as you also see, even during the what would become eventually be the cultural genocide of Native Americans, the United States was uh, enacting a thorough, methodical, and brutal uh, genocide campaign through both massacres of Native American peoples, removing them from their homelands, traditional homelands by force, and by wiping out their food sources. So now this brings us to again the next section, the cultural genocide of Native Americans. So, starting between in 1868 and the 1890s CE, the Native American nations of the Great Plains, the Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the West Coast would gradually and forcibly be moved to reservations by the United States Army. And then in 1871 CE, President Ulysses S. Grant would initiate a policy to assimilate all Native American nations and convert them to Christianity. Uh, and then, because of his assimilation plan, Ulysses S. Grant's assimilation plan, in the 1870s CE, Christian missionaries would travel to Native American reservations in large numbers, where they would establish reservation boarding schools to educate and convert Native American children. In fact, the Christian missionaries believed it was their mission to, quote, civilize the Native Americans, and believed that if Native Americans didn't become civilized, they would go extinct. And we can see this in an example of this in an excerpt of missionary Henry Pancoast's memoir that he wrote in 1883 CE, where it reads, and I quote, of the children at these schools, I scarcely know how to speak. I can perhaps say nothing better than that they are children. The recollection of them is one of unmixed tenderness and delight. They are so happy, so funny, so bright, so childlike, so affectionate, so lovable. I believe the most dogmatic and uncompromising advocate of Indian extermination would forget in their present all his theories about in uh, ineradicable cruelty and treachery of the race. Among all my remembrances of Dakota, there is one that has for me a peculiar and serene beauty. The remembrance of one of those wonderful sunsets in an atmosphere of crystal clearness. A young moon that the red sun made look all the whiter. The shy stars coming, you could not see when, into the faint blue and twilight stillness. In front of the schoolhouse, a ring of Indian children playing uh, Jacob and Rachel. I could now see the free, unconscious grace of their motions, and hear the childish giggles and screams of laughter, and the funny little accent with which they shouted, Jacob, Rachel. I looked at them and thought of the hideous record of unrighteous, greedy, and bloody retaliation that makes up the sad story of their race and of the lives that lay before these children that they thought so little. Yet to look at them was to hope. Mournful, oppressed as the condition of their race is, it may be that out of the darkness and the bondage, a little child shall lead them. So again, you can sort of see the idea of it's their mission to of the missionaries believing it was their mission to civilize Native American children was. And you can see another example in an excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1885 CE that reads, and I quote, these schools strip from the unwashed person of the Indian boy the unwashed blanket, and after instructing him in what to him are the mysteries of personal cleanliness, clothe him with clean garments of civilized men, and teach him how to wear it. They give him information concerning a bed and teach him how to use it, and teach him how, to sit on a chair, how to use a knife and fork, how to eat at a table, and what to. While he's learning these things, he is also learning to read and write, and at the same time is being taught how to work and how to earn a living. And again, you can see within within this report the idea that it is missionaries mission it is the mission of Christian missionaries to quote civilize the children of Native American peoples. Then in 1879 CE, Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt would found Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was the first off-reservation Native American boarding school. Pratt specifically subscribed to the motto, kill the Indian, save the man. We can see this in excerpts from Pratt's speech on the advantages of mingling Indians with whites that he gave in 1892 CE that reads, and I quote, a great general has said that with the first excerpt reading, and I quote, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, save the man. And then the next excerpt from the speech reads, and I quote, it is a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He is born blank, right, like all the rest of us, left in the surroundings of savagery. He grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. We, left in the surroundings of civilization, grow to possess a civilized language, life, and purpose. Transfer the infant white to the savage surroundings. He will grow to possess a savage language, superstition, and habit. Transfer the savage born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. These results have been established over and over again beyond all question. And it is well established that those advanced in life, even to maturity of either class, uh, lose already acquired qualities belonging to the side of their birth, and gradually take on those of the side which they have been transferred. And here's the source that I got this from. Then, in 1887 CE, the United States would create the Dawes Act, with the act being used to subdivide Native American tribal communal landholdings into allotments for Native American heads of families and individuals. This was an attempt to convert traditional systems of land tenure into a government-imposed private property a system of private property by forcing Native Americans to, quote, assume a capitalist and proprietary relationship with property. With this, in this idea actually did not this motto did and philosophy did not previously exist in Native American cultures. The act was actually highly unpopular in Native American communities. I'm assuming unsurprising to anybody watching. However, resistance to the act was often met with violence at the hands of the United States, as seen with the eventual execution of Cherokee elder Ned Christie. And I, in fact, actually did a video on Ned Christie and his eventual execution that I will include in the iCard. Then, starting in 1902 CE, Carlisle and its curriculum would become the model for 25 federally funded off-reservation schools in 15 different states and territories, with a total enrollment of over 6,000 students. Now, this brings us to our next section, federally supported boarding schools. Starting with what the goal of these boarding schools was. So, when students arrived at boarding schools, their lives were altered dramatically. They were given short haircuts, which was a source of shame for boys, as many Native American nation, the boys of many Native American nations, as they viewed their hair as sacred and still view their hair as sacred, and still consider long hair part of their maturing identity. Children were required to wear uniforms and to take English names for use at the school, and sometimes the names were based on their own names. However, other times their names were assigned at random. And the children were not allowed to speak their own languages, even between each other. And we can see, actually, I want to go back to the previous slide. We can see an example of that here, where this is actually the same boy. He is a Navajo or Dene boy, and this is him before and going to, I believe he went to Carlisle Industrial Indian School, and this is after he went there. Another thing I want to point out real quick is you can see in this picture he is slightly darker in complexion than he is here. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is they would put makeup on Native American children uh, after they had their haircut and were in European and American uniforms to make it look like that. Oh, look, see, civilizing them has made them whiter. But there's also a much more nefarious uh, part of this that I will. I mean, if it wasn't already nefarious, but an even more nefarious part of this that I will talk about just a little bit later in the video. But here's some more pictures here, here, and here. And with all that in mind, a primary goal of the Native American boarding schools was to convert Native American children to Christianity. We can see an example of this in an excerpt of the personal account of a girl who attended a Native American boarding school, with this account being written sometime in the 1890s CE, with the excerpt reading, and I quote, a small bell was tapped, and each of the pupils drew a chair from under the table. Supposing this act meant that they were to be seated, I pulled out mine and at once slipped it in front from one side. But when I turned my head, I saw that I was the only one seated, and all the rest at the table were standing. Just as I began to rise, looking shyly around to see how chairs were to be used, a second bell was sounded. All were seated at last. I had to crawl back into my chair again. I heard a man's voice at one end of the hall, and I looked around to see him, but all the others hung their heads over their plates. As I glanced at the long chain of tables, I caused the eyes of a pale-faced woman upon me. I immediately dropped my eyes, wondering why it was so keenly watched by the strange woman. The man ceased his mutterings, and then a third bell was tapped. Everyone picked up his knife and fork and began eating. I began crying instead, for by this time I was afraid to venture anything more. So you can see in this excerpt, while obviously she doesn't say it outright, it's very clear that the teachers and missionaries at these boarding schools, or it's, in this case at the boarding school that she attended, were training them to do Christian rituals like saying grace before dinner. In addition to this, Native American children were taught by skills missionaries and teachers deemed were important for a civilized life, such as domestic duties for girls and vocational schools for boys, such as blacksmithing, farming, etc. Another thing to note is that often Native American parents were actually forced to send their children to Native American boarding schools, and if Native American parents resisted, they would often be imprisoned. An example of this is seen in 1895 CE when 19 men of the Hopi Nation were imprisoned at Alcatraz because they refused to send their children to a boarding school. Which now brings us to our next section, abuse in the boarding schools. Children who were admitted into boarding schools uh, experienced several forms of abuse, and we can see this in multiple different personal accounts of Native American students. For example, in an excerpt of one student's experience, and I quote, intimidation and fear were very much present in our daily lives. For instance, we would cower from the abusive disciplinary practices of some superiors, such as the one who yanked my cousin's ear hard enough to tear it. After a 9-year-old girl was raped in her dormitory bed during the night, we girls would be so scared that we would jump into each other's bed as soon as the lights went out. The sustained terror in our hearts further tested our endurance, as it was better to suffer with a full bladder and be safe than to walk through the dark, seemingly endless hallway to the bathroom. When we were older, we girls anguished each time we entered the classroom of a certain male teacher who stalked and molested girls. And here are the sources that I got this information from. And we can see another example in an excerpt from a report from the Indian Rights Association written in 1903, with this excerpt reading, and I quote, Virginia Weeks. The pupil in question was an orphan of the Pawnee tribe, about 18 years of age, of rather fragile body, she being consumptive, meaning she had tuberculosis. The girl's testimony was that in punishment for the offense, the superintendent took her to his private office and locked the door so that nobody could witness the chastisement, that he beat her with a yardstick, throwing her to the floor and jerking her about. Finally took her to the laundry room where the offense was committed, demanding that she apologize to the employee with whom she had the difficulty. This she refused to do, and the superintendent took her to the barn, where he could not be seen, and beat her with a strap about 5 feet long, which he held by the loose ends in his hands, so that the doubled portion could be applied to her body. After beating her with the strap for some time, he again asked her if she was willing to apologize. Still refusing, the superintendent continued whipping her until he beat her into submission, whereupon he returned to the laundry and she repeated after him the words of apology demanded. And here is the source here. And then we have a testimony from Julia Hardin, an 18-year-old Potawatomi student who testified in a congressional hearing that when she refused to leave for an outing on short notice, the school disciplinarian, Claude Stoffer, slapped her across the face, and demanded, quote, "You are going to check and go to the country tonight at 5 o'clock." And then Hardin further testified that Stauffer then, quote, jerked a board down from one of the window sills and he punched me down on the floor and two of the matrons held me down. Miss Ridenor was one, and I don't know who the other was. They put down the curtains so no one could see in and they locked the door. Here's the source that I got that from. On top of this, missionaries and teachers at Native American boarding schools would often deprive children of food as a form of punishment. And we can see an example of this in an excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1892 CE that reads, and I quote, in many instances, the more hardened, those who are naturally brutish and whose training has developed their animal and left their higher nature undeveloped, do not respond to moral appeals, are indifferent to milder forms of punishment, and can be reached apparently in no other way than by corporal punishment, confinement, deprivation of privileges, or restriction of diet. And in fact, this withholding of food would, of course, cause malnutrition, which would lead to the lightening of skin, is something I talked about in the first picture of the Navajo Dene boy, uh, uh, of his before and after picture uh, from when he went to Carlisle. Um, On top of this, Native American boarding schools in the United States and Native American residential schools in Canada would routinely perform nutrition experiments on Native American children by starving them and would also forcibly sterilize Native American girls. In the case of Canada, these experiments, nutrition experiments, happened between 1942 and 1952 CE. And this is something that is talked about uh, at length by academics such as Ian Mosby in his academic paper titled "Administering Colonial Science, Nutrition Research, and Human Biomedical Experimentation in Aboriginal Communities and Residential Schools, 1942 to 1952." And then the sterilization is talked about at length by academics, uh, as seen in this thesis here, titled "The Sterilization of Native American Women in Oklahoma," where it talks about in 1974, for example, Oklahoma sterilized 48 Native American women in the month of July alone. And this was done at the Indian Health Service Hospital in Claremore. And of course, there was a lot more done than this. Now we come to the next section, disease and death at Native American boarding schools. Native American children at Native American boarding schools would often die of diseases such as tuberculosis, also known as consumption, measles, and trachoma. And then on top of that, many Native American children would die at Native American boarding schools as a result of the Spanish flu, which happened between 1918 and 1919 CE. And we can see examples of and firsthand accounts of the deaths of Native American children as a result of disease. For example, one uh, uh, excerpt from a letter from Richard H. Pratt to Lakota leader White Thunder about the death of White Thunder's son. Uh, um, a letter he wrote to White Thunder on December 14th, 1880 CE reads, and I quote, all the time he got sick. I have done everything I could to make him get well. I had to make him go to the hospital and had to take his clothes away from him to keep him in bed. He would not eat, and he would not take medicine unless I made him, and then he would spit it out. All the time he had the doctor see him often every day and night. Whatever was good, we got for him oranges and grapes and other nice things he had always liked. After to eat and to take medicine, but he had got so weak that all our care would not save him. And here's the source that I got this from. And then we can see another example of Native American children dying of disease at Native American boarding schools in this excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1897 CE that reads, and I quote, when a pupil begins to have hemorrhages from the lungs, he or she knows, and all the rest know, just what they mean, in spite of everything cheerful that can be said or done. And such incidents keep occurring at intervals throughout every year. Not many pupils die in the school. They prefer not to do so, and the last wishes of themselves and their parents are not disregarded, but they go home and die, and the effect in the school is much the same. Four have done so this year, as many more have gone out who undoubtedly will never be able to return, and others, in still larger numbers, have had hemorrhages from the lungs or the terrible scrofulous swellings, which we know and they know practically certify their fate. Keeping them in school at all times becomes a rather painful task. And here's the source that I got that from. Now, this brings us to our next section, resistance. Despite the risk of imprisonment, many Native American parents would often refuse to send their children to Native American boarding schools. We can see examples of this, for example, in an excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to the Secretary of Interior, written in 1882 CE, that reads, and I quote, the Indians scare the children by telling them if they attend the school, they will be taken from their homes and made soldiers. The Indians have a prejudice against schools. I have labored to do away with it, but it takes a good deal of time to overcome their objection. And then we can see another excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to the Secretary of the Interior in 1897 CE that reads, and I quote, over any past year, I've had to obtain most of the pupils by force, using police for the purpose. The Crows are bitterly opposed to sending their children to school and invent all kinds of excuses to get children out or to keep from sending them to the school. And here are the sources that I got all this information from. On top of this, Native American children at Native American boarding schools would resist assimilation in diverse ways. For example, in her memoir, Navajo woman Irene Stewart states that while attending a Native American boarding school, that quote during the evenings, we told Navajo stories, and then an excerpt from the memoir of Omaha man Francis LaFleche describes how that he and his Omaha friends retreated to a small storeroom where they told stories by candlelight, where the small boys had been marched to bed at 8 o'clock. We, the middle five, who for the first time were permitted to stay up until 10, a privilege hereto enjoyed only by the big seven, sat around the fire listening to Indian tales told by Edwin in its animated way. There was no light in the room save that which came through the opening door of the stove, in front of which the storyteller had taken his place. The flickering fire cast a ruddy light upon the fine features of the boy, and the shadows on the wall danced to caprice of the restless flames. We laughed heartily at the mishaps of Ishtehneke. I do apologize if I butchered that to any members of the Omaha Nation who are watching. But the mishaps of Ishtehneke, a comical character that figures in the folk tales of the Omahas, as they were vividly portrayed in language and gesture. And LaFleche also states that the pemmican secured in raids on nearby camps, which was an old Omaha ritual, with LaFleche stating, Edwin continued the leader in the same tone. Aho, said Edwin, giving the response and imitating the voice of a grown-up and serious warrior. The word of command is before you two, continued Alec. The leader, and it is that soon after Graybeard has gone to bed, you were to go to the village and enter the house of Hai Sha Rege. Again, I apologize if I butchered that. Where you will see a woman making pemmican. You will say to her, Woman, we are the commanded and the bearers of the word of command. Of you we demand a bag of pemmican. Give willingly, and you shall go beyond the four hills of life without stumbling. There shall be no weariness in the path of life to hinder your feet, and your grandchildren may be shall be many, and their succession endless. Fail not in your mission. Your way out of the house shall be through the windows in our dormitory and by a rope. And here are the source. This is the source that I got this from. But as you can see in this example here, uh, students very much were finding ways, Native American students were very much finding ways to hold on to their traditional cultures in spite of the forced cultural assimilation and cultural genocide uh, by the United States. In fact, we can see another example of this in the memoir of one Apache boy who recalls that during his time at a Native American boarding school, that quote, even when we were in school, we used to think about our own people and our own ways. Someone in the dormitory would start telling a coyote story. While it was being told, everyone would be quiet, and then at the end of the story, all would break out laughing. And here's the source I got that from. Uh, on top of this, many Native American children would resist assimilation at Native American boarding schools by running away. And we can see examples of this in an excerpt from the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1886 CE that reads, and I quote, the highest enrollment at any one time has been 78. The average attendance for the year has been 71. Much irregularity has been caused in the attendance of an account of the pernicious habit of running away. And then a year later, the same uh, superintendent, the same Indian agent, would write to the in a report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1887 CE that quote, an Indian girl ran away from the school in December and was badly frozen. Another case in January resulted in death to a young 16 is a young girl 16 years of age. An Indian child will run away whenever the roving disposition seizes it. The facilities for escaping from school here could not be excelled. 3 rods from the school begins in an interminable swamp, and uh, once they reach that, all hope is lost in catching them until they arrive at the agency. Nothing but a wall surrounding the school with iron gates, sentinels posted, could prevent escape. And here's the sources I got that from. And then we can see another example of this in an excerpt from the memoir of Hopi woman Helen Says Squatewa, uh, written in 1969 CE, that reads, and I quote, one Saturday morning when we were out on the playground, our attention was drawn to the yard of the main office where many Navajos, among them many policemen had ridden up on horses. We could not hear them, but concluded they were talking loud because of violent gesturing. Then one policeman dismounted and stepping forward, took off the shirt of his uniform, and threw it on the ground at the feet of the superintendent. He had other clothes under his uniform. Then he jumped on his horse, snatched the bridle of an extra horse standing conveniently nearby, and went galloping down to the bottom terrace below the school grounds. I had noticed the two Navajo girls sitting on the lowest step of the lowest terrace, each holding in her hand a little kerchiefed bundle and watching the commotion in the front of the main office. When the policeman started toward the girls, they stood up. He stopped in front of them, took the hand of one girl, and helped her mount behind him on the horse, while the second girl leapt to the back of the second horse. We all watched as they raced up the canyon to freedom. When we turned our eyes back to the group of men, the crowd was dispersing. Nobody made any effort to go after the runaways. The Navajo policemen did not want to bring the girls back. and here's the source that I got that from. But as you can see from this source and the two previous sources, um, Native American children at any chance would run away um, to return home. On top of this, often when Native American children did return home, whether they graduated from these Native American boarding schools or whether they were visiting due to holidays or due to sickness, they would abandon the skills taught to them and abandon Christianity. This is due to a variety of things. One, the influence of their family members, um, as well as the resistance they had already been doing at the Native American boarding schools, and the lack of infrastructure at reservations to support European industries such as factory work. And we can see examples of this in firsthand accounts of Native Americans abandoning assimilation upon returning home. Uh, we can see one example in an excerpt of the memoir from the memoir of Kiowa Apache man Jim White Wolf, written in 1969 CE, that reads, and I quote, "My eyes bothered me. Those days, all the children seemed to have sore eyes. I lost the sight in my left eye. I was taken to the eye doctor, and he said that I had bad eyes. They told the agent about it. After that, they never bothered me about going back to school. For about 2 years, my eyesight was very dim. I stayed close to home then. I didn't do much of anything. They took me to an Indian woman doctor. She took a piece of glass from a bottle and cut away some white substance that was growing over my left eye. After that, I could see better. After she had cured me, my father gave this woman a horse. That was more valuable than money then. Some of the Apache doctors then would require you to bring four things, but this woman didn't. She gave me some stuff like salt uh, from the creek and something else to mix with it, and told me to put this in my eye. I used this until I saw my eyesight was all right, and then I quit. I would go around to dances visiting, but I never returned to school. And I so this source, serves something a little a twofold goal. One, it shows proves an earlier point that I talked about in the video about how Native American children at Native American boarding schools would often be would often fall sick to a variety of diseases such as tuberculosis, measles, or trachoma in this case. But also, it shows that when Native American children were sent home due to being sick, they would turn to traditional Native American, in this case, traditional Apache uh, medicinal uh, practices to cure their ailments, and would, upon being cured, or not return to school and would return to their traditional Native American ways. We can see another example of this in an excerpt from the memoir of Arapaho student Althea Bass, written in 1966 CE, that reads, and I quote, "After 2 years, I grew sick and was sent back to the reservation to get well. It was good to come back to Darlington once more, to hear Arapaho spoken, to take part in Arapaho ceremonies and eat Arapaho food." And then we see a similar example in the memoir of Hopi man Don Chuka Taliesin, uh, where he states that after returning home from the Native American boarding school, the Sherman Institute, that quote, "It was important that I learned how to get along with the white men and make money by helping them. But my death experience had taught me that I had a Hopi spirit guide whom I must follow if I wished to live. I wanted to become a real Hopi again, to sing the good old Kachina songs, and to feel free to make love without fear of sin or rawhide." And you can see, and these are the sources that I got all this from. And you can see again in this source and all the other sources just how quickly um, Native American students chose to go back to their traditional Native American religious practices and cultural practices upon returning home. And just how much they valued their traditional practices over, again, the forced uh, imposition of American and European cultural practices, um, again, coming from forced cultural assimilation and cultural genocide. Another big example of this is that in resistance to forced assimilation and the expansion of the United States, uh, Paiute religious leader Wavoka would found the Ghost Dance movement. The basis for the Ghost Dance movement was the circle dance, a traditional Native American dance which involved moving in a circular formation in large groups. The Ghost Dance movement believed that proper practice of the dance would reunite the living with the spirits of the dead, bring the spirits to fight on their behalf, and would end westward expansion of the United States and bring peace, prosperity, and unity to Native American peoples throughout the region, with the Ghost Dance movement being created in 1890 CE. Uh, Unsurprisingly, many Native Americans who would returned from Native American boarding schools and many prominent Native American leaders would join the Ghost Dance movement. However, again, unsurprisingly, and I'm sure unsurprising to anyone watching this, the Ghost Dance movement was often met with violence, as seen with the assassination of Lakota leader Sitting Bull for his connection and involvement with the movement. The United States retaliation and violence against the practitioners of the ghost dance would culminate in the massacre of between 250 to 300 mostly unarmed Lakota at the hands of the United States Army, an event that would become known as the Wounded Knee Massacre, the largest massacre of Native Americans by the United States Army, period. And this happened on December 29th, 1890 CE. And again, I asked people watching this video to take a second and look at these pictures to truly absorb the horror and brutality of the Wounded Knee Massacre that the United States committed against the Lakota people. All right. Many of the Lakota killed, one thing that's important to point out, many of the Lakota killed at Wounded Knee were actually schoolboys. And we can see this in an excerpt from Charles Wesley Allen's account of the Wounded Knee Massacre that reads, and I quote, on reaching the corner of the green where the schoolboys had been so happy in their sports, but a short time before, there was spread before me the saddest picture I had seen or was to see thereafter. For on the spot of their playful choice were scattered the prostrate bodies of all those fine little boys, cold in death. And here's the source that I got that from. Another example of resistance against the forced cultural assimilation and cultural genocide of Native American peoples and children at the hands of the United States can be seen in the resurgence of traditional Native American rituals and religious practices, particularly those connected to warfare during World War One. For example, we can see an example of this in Native American men joining the United States Expeditionary Forces as a way to gain honors traditionally gained by raiding rival nations, as seen in an excerpt of a Pawnee man's personal letter to the superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, written in 1917 CE, that reads, and I quote, I hope all Pawnee young men will join the Army or Navy and show to the world the bravery of the Pawnee Indians. Tell Lawrence I shall be proud of him, Lawrence being his son, knowing that he has shouldered a gun to defend our country's rights, and if he should go to the front, for him to show no cowardice, but to be brave and to keep up his ancestors' courage, for many of them died on the plains fighting for the government. Tell him that I say it is honor among the Pawnees to die upon the battlefield than to die at home and be buried. And here's the source I got that from. And then we can see other examples of this, such as Lakota dancers who ritually counted coup on an effigy of Kaiser Wilhelm during World War One. And here's an example of what counting coup is. Essentially, counting coup uh, was a military and warfare ritual of the Great Plains nations that involved touching an enemy without killing them. And there were various other tiers uh, uh, and nuances to counting coup, which you can see in these pictures here. But generally, it was more based on touching an enemy without killing them, which was very honorable to the Native American peoples and nations of the Great Plains. And then we can see another example in Apache and Pawnee communities performing victory dances at the end of World War One while wearing German helmets and other items taken from German soldiers. And then one of the largest and most expansive examples of resistance against by Native American peoples and children against the forced cultural assimilation and cultural genocide of their peoples can be seen in the fact that Native American children who attended these boarding schools came from a diverse number of Native American nations, um, allowing them to interact at these Native American boarding schools, which would then allow Native American children to work together to preserve their traditional practices, which in turn would lay the groundwork for the resurgence of pan-Native American movements such as the peyote religion, also known as the Native American Church. So, what is the peyote religion, the Native American Church? Well, this religion was founded by Comanche leader Quanah Parker in 1918 CE, and the peyote religion, also known as the Native American Church, is a pan-Native American religion based on the belief that peyote is a sacred and holy sacrament and is a means to communicate with the Great Spirit, also referred to as the Creator. There are multiple denominations of the peyote religion, the Native American Church, uh, with some disliking the beliefs of Christianity because of the history between Native Americans and European Christian groups, while other denominations are comfortable with a syncretic spiritual way that combines their indigenous ways with some aspects of Christianity. And it is important to note that, in contrast to, say, the Ghost Dance movement, the United States was never able to eradicate the peyote religion or the Native, also known as the Native American Church. In fact, it is still a religious movement that exists to this day. Now that brings us to our next section, accommodation. So, while Native American peoples and Native American children were resisting the forced cultural assimilation, cultural genocide at the hands of the United States, several Native American nations, such as the Hopi, the Cherokee, and the Oneida, among others, were slightly more willing to accommodate the curriculums of Native American boarding schools. And I say slightly because, as you remember, several sources I brought up earlier about resistance were from Hopi sources, but still, that aside, there was some degree of willingness to accommodate the curriculum to a point. Again, not completely willing, but still. And the reason for this is that most of the nations that were willing to accommodate the curriculums of Native American boarding schools were Native American nations that were already sedentary agriculturalists and had already adopted some European practices, living style dwellings, and had many citizens who had already converted to Christianity since the 1700s and early 1800s CE. It's important to note that many such as the Hopi and other Pueblo and southwestern Native American nations were converted and forced to converted by force and were forcibly made to adopt European practices by the Spanish Empire. But others, such as the Oneida and the Cherokee, willingly adopted some aspect of European culture in the early 1800s. But that aside, they had already adopted these European practices and dwellings, and some had already converted to Christianity. And therefore, they were able to adopt aspects of white American culture while maintaining much of their traditional culture. However, and it's a big however, these Native American students were still often subject to the same brutal treatment common at all Native American boarding schools. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the decline of Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So, in 1903 CE, Richard Henry Pratt would be forced to retire as superintendent of Carlisle after 24 years and was placed on the retired list as a brigadier general in the United States due to his public denouncing of the Indian Bureau and the reservation system as a hindrance to the civilization and assimilation of Native Americans. Pratt, in fact, stated, and I quote, better, far better for the Indians had there never been a bureau. Which, to be fair, he's not completely wrong, but he's also, right for the wrong reasons because he still wanted to do the cultural genocide and full scale genocide of Native American peoples, but he wanted it done his way rather than the way of the Indian Bureau, which again, the Indian Bureau was bad too, and in still many ways still is bad. I'm not Native American, obviously, so I'll leave that judgment really to any people who are Native American. But I do think it's important to point out that while Pratt is right in one tiny regard, he was still advocating for cultural and full scale genocide. After Pratt's retirement, attendance at Carlisle Indian Industrial School would decline with the growth of more localized private and government reservations in the West, meaning children were no longer needed to travel to a distant eastern school in Pennsylvania. And then there would be a further additional reduction of enrollment during World War One, as many Carlisle alumni and students would serve in the United States military during the war. And then Carlisle Industrial School would officially close on September 1st, 1918 CE. And I want everyone watching to pay particular attention to this last sentence here, talking about how there are in the cemetery of Carlisle Industrial School, there are 186 graves of students who died while at Carlisle. We will talk about that very shortly. All right, now this brings us to the legacy of Native American boarding schools. So while Carlisle Industrial School closed, all other Native American boarding schools would remain in use until the early 1900s when most of them closed down. And I want you to keep that in your mind, most of them. And we will again get into that in a second. Native American boarding schools have a long-lasting negative effects on the mental health of Native Americans that are still felt to this day. In fact, it's important to note many people who went to these boarding schools are still alive or know family members who went to these boarding schools. An example of the long-lasting negative effects on Native American peoples and their mental health can be seen in this paper written by Teresa Evans Campbell et al. In the the American Journal of Drug, Alcohol, and Alcohol Abuse, Volume 38, Number 5, titled Indian Boarding School Experience, Substance Use, and Mental Health Among Urban Two-Spirit American Indian Alaskan Natives, where they talk about the PTSD caused by attending these Native American boarding schools and how it has led many Native American individuals to resort to drugs to deal with said PTSD. And you can see that in this table here and this table here. On top of that, an estimate of 7 to 10s of thousands, and I say tens of thousands for a reason because the exact count is still not known. Tens of thousands of Native American children would die in Native American boarding schools in the United States and in Native American residential schools in Canada. These children were left, and in many cases are still left in unmarked graves, with these graves only recently, like within the last 3 or 4 years, being found, and the children, again, only within the last 3 or 4 years being returned to their families. And you can see an example of these unmarked graves that have been discovered here. And here is a protest that was done about these unmarked graves. And again, it's important to note many of these children died very recently within the 80s and 90s and 70s onwards. Many of these children have living family members. This is absolutely something that is abhorrent that should never have happened. On top of that, um, it's important to note, as I alluded to earlier, despite most of the Native American boarding schools in the United States closing, there are still four operational Native American boarding schools in the United States, including St. Joseph's and St. Laurie's, with these schools still being known for the mistreatment of Native American students and still focusing heavily on conversion to Christianity. And I do want to state that I'm sure there are some Native Americans who maybe had a more positive experience with these schools. I'm not going to make a judgment call on that. I'm, again, a white guy. I will leave that judgment call to other Native American peoples. However, I will caveat with that is that uh, the negative accounts of these schools that I heard about, actually, I heard from Native American activists, such as a two-spirit, not non-binary Native American individual from the Tlingit Nation named who goes by the handle "Show Me Your Mask," where they are at the forefront of repatriation of children's graves of the Native American children from these boarding schools to parents, and so also so is their father, and they and their father and everyone they work with has pointed out just how shady, at the very least, these four remaining Native American boarding schools are. And I will include a link to Show Me Your Mass YouTube channel in the description. And all right, that brings me to the end of uh, this video. I hope everyone watching this video learned a lot. And I hope this encourages people watching this video to learn more about the cultural genocide of Native American peoples, because obviously I could only cover so much in this video. It's a very complex and nuanced subject. I hope it encourages people to go out and do more activism to bring and hope encourages people to talk about this event and bring it to the light because it's something that should never have happened. It's something that a lot of people don't know about until recently. Uh, Something that needs to be talked about, and it's something that we need to make sure never happens again. I wish I had something more positive to end the video on and like silver linings, but unfortunately, due to the nature of the video, I don't have that. So, all right. So with that, I'm going to end the video. If anyone wants to see me cover anything that I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.